Picture a modern tourist descending into the Paris catacombs, surrounded by walls lined with 6 million human skulls, arranged in decorative patterns. Above them, couples stroll along the Seine at sunset, taking selfies with the illuminated Eiffel Tower. The contrast seems impossible. How does the same city hold both romantic beauty and an empire of the dead stretching for miles beneath the streets? This is the central paradox of Paris. The very name City of Light comes not from some poetic metaphor, but from a desperate battle against literal darkness. For nearly 2 millennia, Paris existed as one of Europe's most notoriously filthy, dangerous, and diseased urban hellholes. The beautiful city tourists visit today isn't built despite this dark history. It's built directly on top of it. Every grand boulevard, every elegant facade, every engineering marvel that makes modern Paris livable represents a victory over conditions so horrific they bordered on the apocalyptic. The lights that gave the city its nickname weren't installed to create ambience. They were a military necessity in streets so dangerous and foul that walking them after dark was often a death sentence. The bones in the catacombs tell only part of the story. Beneath Paris lies the archaeological evidence of systematic urban failure. Centuries of a city at war with its own geography, its own waste, its own dead. This isn't the romanticized history of kings and artists. This is the story of how one of the world's most beautiful cities was quite literally carved from one of its most nightmarish. Paris was cursed from the moment of its conception. The Celtic Parisian tribe, sometime around the 3rd century BC, chose to settle on what would become the Île de la Cité for the most basic reason possible. It was defensible. Surrounded by the winding Seine, this marshy island could be held against raiders. What the Parisians either ignored or failed to understand was that they had built their settlement in a swamp. When Julius Caesar's legions arrived in 52 BC, they found a fortified village literally sinking into waterlogged ground. The Romans, with their engineering expertise, attempted to impose order on this geographical nightmare. They renamed the settlement Lutetia, likely derived from the Celtic word for swamp or muddy place. The name itself was an admission of defeat. They were building a city in a bog. Roman Lutetia struggled against its environment from the beginning. The famous Roman baths, whose ruins still exist today, required constant maintenance as groundwater seeped through foundations. Streets couldn't be properly paved because the underlying soil shifted with every seasonal flood. The Seine, rather than being the romantic waterway of modern Paris, was an unpredictable, frequently violent river that regularly overwhelmed its banks and turned the surrounding area into a temporary lake. The Romans did what Romans did. They built anyway. Stone by stone, they tried to create a Mediterranean city in a northern European swamp. But Lutetia never thrived the way other Roman settlements did. The population remained small, the infrastructure remained precarious, and the city remained fundamentally at odds with the land it occupied. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, Lutetia was abandoned by everyone who could afford to leave. The careful Roman drainage systems fell into disrepair. The stone buildings cracked and shifted as their foundations settled into the soggy earth. What remained was a half-ruined settlement that flooded regularly and smelled perpetually of stagnant water and decay. The Frankish kings who eventually claimed the site faced the same fundamental problem as their Celtic and Roman predecessors. They were trying to build a city in a place where cities shouldn't exist. But by then, the settlement's strategic position on the Seine had made it too valuable to abandon. Trade routes converged on the river crossing, and whoever controlled the Île de la Cité controlled movement through northern France. So medieval Paris was built on a foundation of compromise with environmental impossibility. The ground was too wet for proper foundations, so buildings simply settled and shifted over time. The river flooded regularly, so the lowest areas of the city became temporary lakes every few years. The soil couldn't properly drain, so standing water collected everywhere, creating perfect conditions for disease and decay. This geographic curse would define Paris for the next 1,000 years. Every urban crisis, the famous filth, the catastrophic burial problems, the eventual need for massive reconstruction, can be traced back to this original sin. The Parisians built their settlement in a swamp. The Romans tried to engineer their way out of the swamp, and every generation afterward inherited a city that was fundamentally fighting against the land it occupied. Modern Paris exists because engineers in the 19th century finally developed the technology to win that fight. Massive pumps, deep sewers, steel-reinforced foundations. But for nearly 2 millennia, the city's residents lived with the consequences of that original, cursed decision to build a major settlement in a place where nature never intended one to exist. By 1200 AD, Paris had transformed from a struggling swamp settlement into something far worse. A densely packed urban prison where human misery was compressed into an area smaller than most modern city blocks. The medieval city was surrounded by defensive walls that made expansion impossible. So as the population grew, the only option was to pack more people into the same rotting, waterlogged space. The streets of medieval Paris weren't streets in any modern sense. They were narrow channels, rarely more than 6 feet wide, that served as the city's entire sanitation system. Every morning, Parisians opened their windows and shouted, "Gare l'eau!" Watch out for the water, before dumping the contents of their chamber pots directly onto the cobblestones below. Human waste mixed with animal dung from horses, pigs, and cattle that shared the streets with pedestrians. Butchers threw blood, bones, and offal from their shops directly onto the pavement. Walking through Paris meant navigating a slick, putrid obstacle course of human and animal excrement, industrial waste, and decomposing organic matter. The city's residents developed a distinctive shuffling gait, carefully feeling their way across the treacherous, filth-slicked cobblestones. Falling meant not just injury, but potential death from the toxic soup of disease-carrying waste that coated every surface. The Bièvre River, which flowed through the southern districts of Paris, had ceased to be water in any meaningful sense. Tanneries lined its banks, dumping the blood and flesh scraped from animal hides directly into the current. Dye works added their own contributions, chemical runoff that turned the river unnaturally vivid colors. On any given day, the Bièvre might run red with blood, blue with indigo, or black with tanning acids. The stench was so overwhelming that residents living along its banks were known to suffer from a peculiar form of madness attributed to breathing the fumes. Inside the cramped houses, conditions were no better. Most buildings rose 5 or 6 stories, each floor projecting further over the street than the one below, until the top floors of opposing buildings nearly touched. This created a canopy effect that blocked sunlight from ever reaching street level. Medieval Paris existed in perpetual twilight, a city where noon looked like dusk and actual darkness was so complete that venturing outside after sunset was virtually impossible. The lack of light compounded every other problem. In the permanent dimness, it was impossible to see the filth you were walking through until you stepped in it. Streets became anonymous rivers of waste where the exact composition of the slick, ankle-deep muck underfoot remained mercifully unclear. The darkness also made the city extraordinarily dangerous. Robbers and murderers could operate with near impunity in streets where their victims couldn't see them until it was too late. No concept of public sanitation existed. The very idea that human waste shouldn't be thrown into the streets, that animal blood shouldn't flow freely through residential areas, that drinking water should be separated from sewage, these notions were completely absent from medieval urban planning. Paris operated on the assumption that waste would somehow disappear if enough of it accumulated, that the city's problems would solve themselves through sheer volume. The sensory assault was inescapable. The stench penetrated clothing, hair, and skin. Residents developed a distinctive smell that marked them as Parisians wherever they traveled. The sounds were equally overwhelming. The splash of waste hitting cobblestones, the squeal of pigs rooting through garbage, the constant drip of unknown liquids from overhanging buildings, the wet slap of footsteps through the ubiquitous muck. This was the reality of daily life in medieval Paris for hundreds of thousands of people, not for years, but for centuries. Generation after generation grew up in these conditions, lived their entire lives navigating this urban nightmare, and died knowing nothing else. The city that would eventually become synonymous with beauty and culture existed for nearly 1,000 years as one of Europe's most concentrated examples of human suffering caused by the simple impossibility of fitting too many people into too small a space with no understanding of basic sanitation. The walls that protected medieval Paris from external enemies had transformed it into a prison where the inmates were slowly poisoned by their own waste. 5 miles northeast of medieval Paris, on a barren limestone hill that caught the first light of dawn, stood a structure that redefined the relationship between state power and human flesh. The Gibbet of Montfaucon rose 3 tiers high, its 45 stone compartments designed not for storage but for display. Each compartment held iron chains. Each chain held a corpse. This was not an execution site. No crowds gathered here to watch the moment of death. The condemned met their end elsewhere, in the city squares, where justice could be witnessed by the maximum number of subjects. Montfaucon served a different function entirely. It was a warehouse for the dead, a permanent exhibition of royal power that operated through systematic corpse desecration. The architecture itself announced its purpose. Built of massive limestone blocks quarried from the same deposits that honeycomb the ground beneath Paris, the gibbet stretched nearly 30 feet into the sky. Its 3 ascending levels created a pyramid of death visible from every approach to the capital. Travelers saw it first as a dark outline against the horizon, then as a forest of chains, and finally, as the wind shifted, they smelled it. The process began with the royal decree. Those who committed crimes against the crown faced not merely execution, but eternal humiliation. Their bodies, once the brief theatre of public hanging concluded, made the journey to Montfaucon in rough carts. There, specialized workers, men whose occupation existed nowhere else in Europe, fitted iron chains around the corpses' necks, waists, and ankles. The chains were built to last decades. The bodies were meant to hang until they disintegrated entirely. Weather transformed the display according to season. Summer accelerated decomposition, creating a miasma that could be detected 3 miles downwind. The stench became so associated with royal justice that chroniclers described it as the perfume of the king's vengeance. Winter preserved the bodies longer, but made them brittle, causing limbs to snap off in storms and scatter across the hillside. Spring brought the crows. The corvids of Montfaucon became legendary throughout northern France. Generations of birds learned that the gibbet provided reliable carrion, and they developed techniques specific to this abundant food source. They worked systematically, stripping flesh in methodical patterns while avoiding the chains that might trap them. The ground beneath the gibbet grew rich with their droppings, and the scraps they dropped, creating an unnaturally fertile soil that sprouted vegetation no one dared harvest. Local residents developed a complex relationship with their landmark. The gibbet provided employment, not just the chain fitters, but guards, cart drivers, and maintenance workers who repaired the stone structure when weather damaged it. Yet property values in the surrounding villages remained permanently depressed. No amount of economic benefit could overcome the psychological weight of living beneath dozens of rotting criminals. The psychological warfare extended far beyond the immediate vicinity. Montfaucon appeared in sermons throughout the Île-de-France region. Priests used it as a tangible representation of divine justice, arguing that earthly punishment merely foreshadowed eternal damnation. Parents threatened unruly children with the gibbet, and balladeers composed songs about famous criminals whose remains still swayed in its chains. The selection process for Montfaucon revealed the Crown's strategic thinking about public terror. Not every executed criminal earned a place on the gibbet. The structure showcased specific categories of offense against royal authority: forgers of the king's seal, assassins who targeted royal officials, leaders of peasant uprisings, and merchants who defrauded the royal treasury. Each body carried a placard identifying the crime, turning the gibbet into a textbook of forbidden behaviors written in decomposing flesh. Records from the Châtelet prison reveal the bureaucratic machinery that supported this display. Royal officials maintained detailed ledgers tracking which bodies occupied which chains, how long they had been hanging, and their current state of decomposition. When a corpse finally disintegrated beyond recognition, workers removed the chains and prepared the compartment for its next occupant. The waiting list sometimes extended months in advance. The gibbet's impact on Parisian culture proved more profound than its creators anticipated. The permanent visibility of state-sponsored death normalized extreme violence in daily life. Chroniclers note that public executions in the city became increasingly elaborate and brutal during Montfaucon's peak operation. The gibbet established a baseline of acceptable horror that shifted the entire spectrum of public cruelty upward. Foreign dignitaries visiting Paris invariably commented on Montfaucon, usually with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. The Venetian ambassador wrote in 1389 that the gibbet represented a peculiar French innovation in the science of deterrence, while English chroniclers described it as evidence of French barbarism. These reactions suggest that even by medieval standards, Montfaucon pushed the boundaries of acceptable state violence. The gibbet also functioned as a crude weather station for the surrounding region. Farmers learned to read wind patterns by observing how the chains moved, and the direction of the stench indicated atmospheric pressure changes that preceded storms. This practical adaptation to living with industrial-scale death display demonstrates how completely Montfaucon integrated into the rhythm of regional life. For over 4 centuries, the Gibbet of Montfaucon stood as Paris's most visible landmark after Notre Dame Cathedral. It represented royal power, not through beauty or grandeur, but through the systematic degradation of human remains. Every traveler approaching the capital received the same message: the king's authority extended beyond the grave, and defiance earned not merely death, but eternal shame. In the shadow of Les Halles market, where merchants hawked fresh bread and winter apples, lay a quarter-acre plot that had been consuming Paris's dead for 800 years. The cemetery of the Holy Innocents served as the primary burial ground for 22 parish churches, and by 1780 it contained more human remains per square foot than any site in Europe. The ground level had risen 8 feet above the surrounding streets from the sheer accumulation of bodies. The arithmetic of death overwhelmed any attempt at individual burial. Paris generated roughly 30,000 corpses annually, victims of plague, starvation, violence, and the countless diseases that flourished in the medieval city's filth. The Holy Innocents received the majority of these bodies, packed into mass graves called fosses communes that measured 30 feet long, 15 feet wide, and 20 feet deep. Each fosse held between 1,500 and 2,000 corpses, layered like cordwood and separated by thin sprinklings of lime. The cemetery operated on a rotation system that treated human decomposition as an industrial process. Workers dug 5 fosses at a time, filling them systematically over 18 months, then sealing them with wooden boards and dirt. The ground required 5 to 6 years to process the organic matter completely. Once that biological work finished, gravediggers reopened the fosses to find them filled with loose soil, scattered bones, and the occasional preserved skull. They shoveled out this mixture to make room for fresh corpses, transferring the skeletal remains to charnel houses built along the cemetery walls. These charnel houses, called charniers, transformed bone storage into public architecture. 2-story galleries surrounded the cemetery on 3 sides, with the ground floor serving as covered walkways for market shoppers and the upper level housing neatly stacked femurs, rib cages, and skulls arranged in decorative patterns. Parisians grew accustomed to conducting business beneath elaborate mosaics of human remains, turning daily commerce into a meditation on mortality. The proximity to Les Halles Market created a grotesque juxtaposition that defined medieval Parisian life. Customers purchasing meat for dinner walked past walls lined with human bones, while the cemetery's constant emissions of methane and hydrogen sulfide mixed with the aromas of fresh food. The boundary between the living and dead dissolved into a single sensory experience that foreign visitors found overwhelming, but Parisians accepted as normal urban conditions. Ground saturation became a chronic problem as the cemetery exceeded its biological capacity to process organic matter. The soil achieved a consistency that contemporary accounts describe as fatty mud, saturated with human liquefaction that seeped into surrounding basements and contaminated neighborhood wells. Residents of adjacent streets complained that their cellars filled with brownish water that carried fragments of bone and tissue during heavy rains. The cemetery's economics relied on class stratification even in death. Wealthy families purchased individual burial plots along the cemetery walls, marked with stone monuments that created a ring of privilege around the communal horror of the fosses. Middle-class corpses received coffins that delayed their decomposition, disrupting the carefully calculated rotation schedule. The poor arrived wrapped in shrouds or naked, their bodies providing the bulk raw material that kept the system functioning. Religious services in the adjacent Church of the Holy Innocents required constant adaptation to the cemetery's overwhelming presence. Priests burned incense continuously to mask the smell, and the church installed special ventilation systems to prevent toxic gases from accumulating during Mass. Congregants developed the practice of breathing through cloth during services, creating a distinctive ritual of worship filtered through fabric barriers. The cemetery attracted specialized professions that existed nowhere else in Europe. Bone setters arranged skeletal remains in the charnel houses according to aesthetic principles passed down through generations of craftsmen. Fossoyeurs developed techniques for maximizing corpse density in the communal graves, treating human remains as a packing problem requiring geometric precision. Searchers combed through reopened fosses to retrieve jewelry, dental work, and other valuables before the bones went to the charniers. Seasonal variations created predictable cycles of horror. Summer accelerated decomposition, but also generated methane blooms that occasionally ignited spontaneously, creating blue flames that danced across the cemetery at night. Winter froze the ground solid, preventing proper burial and forcing workers to stack fresh corpses in temporary shelters until spring thaws allowed digging to resume. Spring brought swarms of flies that bred in the saturated soil and invaded the surrounding market stalls. The catastrophic collapse of 1780 revealed the cemetery's structural instability after centuries of biological overload. A heavy spring rain saturated the ground beyond its capacity, causing a section of cemetery wall to give way. The collapsed wall belonged to a house on the Rue de la Lingerie, and the cemetery's contents poured directly into the building's basement. The homeowner discovered his cellar filled with a slurry of liquefied human remains, intact skeletons, and centuries of accumulated burial goods mixed into a soup that reached the ground floor. This disaster forced immediate evacuation of surrounding buildings, as the cemetery's contents continued to seep through basement walls and foundation stones. The biological contamination spread through the neighborhood's water supply, creating a public health crisis that reached the royal court. City officials realized that 8 centuries of uncontrolled burial had created an underground lake of human decomposition that threatened the structural integrity of central Paris. The cleanup required a complete reimagining of urban death management. Workers spent months pumping the liquefied remains from flooded basements, while engineers investigated the extent of contamination throughout the Les Halles district. They discovered that the cemetery's biological load had saturated the ground to a depth of 30 feet, creating a zone of permanent toxicity that made the site unusable for any purpose other than continued burial. Public reaction to the collapse marked a turning point in Parisian attitudes toward death and urban planning. The medieval acceptance of living among the dead gave way to demands for sanitary burial practices that protected the living from contamination. The Holy Innocents Cemetery had finally exceeded even Paris's extraordinary tolerance for horror, forcing the city to confront the accumulated weight of 8 centuries worth of corpses rotting in its commercial heart. The cemetery closure, when it finally came, required the largest logistical operation in Parisian history to that point. The systematic removal of 6 million human skeletons to underground quarries outside the city. But that monumental task lay ahead. For now, the Holy Innocents continued to receive its daily quota of fresh corpses, each one adding to the biological disaster brewing beneath the city's most vital marketplace. May 17th, 1780. The ancient stone walls of the Holy Innocents Cemetery gave way, spilling centuries of putrefied human remains into the cellars of surrounding buildings. Parisians woke to find their basements flooded with liquefied corpses, the accumulated dead of 800 years now seeping through their homes. The collapse forced a reckoning the city had avoided for decades. Every cemetery in Badondigue, Paris groaned under the weight of the dead. Bodies stacked 20 deep in mass graves, coffins crushed into splinters under the pressure of new burials. The earth itself had become a saturated sponge of human decay. The solution lay beneath their feet. For centuries, limestone quarries had honeycombed the ground under Paris, vast networks of tunnels and chambers where workers had carved out the very stones that built the city above. Now abandoned, these underground labyrinths would serve a new purpose. In 1786, the authorities began the most macabre urban project in European history. They would empty every overflowing cemetery in Paris and relocate the dead to the quarries below. 6 million corpses would be moved in a 2-year operation that transformed the city into a nightly funeral procession. The work began after dark. Black-draped wagons rolled through empty streets, loaded with bones exhumed from cemetery after cemetery. Teams of laborers dug up graves that had been sealed for centuries, revealing the compressed layers of Parisian mortality. Medieval merchants buried atop Roman settlers, plague victims mixed with guillotine casualties. Priests walked beside the wagons, chanting prayers for the disturbed dead as the procession wound through the silent city. Citizens shuttered their windows against the sight and smell. The very cobblestones seemed to weep with the runoff from overloaded carts. At designated quarry entrances, the bones were unceremoniously dumped into the darkness below. Skulls rolled down stone passages, femurs clattered against tunnel walls, ribs scattered like broken pottery. There was no dignity in this mass relocation, no individual graves or markers. The dead of Paris became an anonymous heap in the bowels of the earth. The deeper chambers filled first. Workers waded through ankle-deep accumulations of human remains, using shovels and rakes to spread the bones into even layers. The larger tunnels became rivers of calcium and phosphate, flowing streams of dissolved humanity. Night after night, month after month, the wagons rolled. The city above tried to sleep while its ancestors were carted away in pieces. Shopkeepers reported drops in business as customers avoided streets along the funeral routes. The air itself seemed heavier, thick with the dust of disturbed graves and the prayers of overwhelmed priests. By 1788, the project neared completion. 6 million Parisians had been relocated from their above-ground resting places to the quarries below. The abandoned cemeteries were filled with fresh earth and converted to markets, squares, and buildings. The city had literally built its future on the buried past. But the bones weren't simply dumped and forgotten. Someone made a decision that revealed the peculiar French relationship with mortality. The scattered remains were arranged, organized, transformed into something between art installation and architectural statement. Skulls were stacked into precise walls, femurs formed decorative patterns, rib cages created archways. The anonymous dead became building materials for an underground empire, their bones serving as both structure and ornament in the tunnels below. The catacombs represented more than practical cemetery management. They embodied the Parisian genius for transforming horror into beauty, chaos into order. The same impulse that would later drive Haussmann's brutal reconstruction was already at work. The willingness to destroy the past to create a more pleasing present, regardless of human cost. Visitors to the completed catacombs found carefully arranged corridors lined with human remains. Plaques bearing philosophical inscriptions about mortality adorned walls built from the bones of their ancestors. The randomly dumped dead had been curated into a tourist attraction, death domesticated through aesthetic arrangement. This underground city of the dead stretched for miles beneath Paris. 6 million souls formed the foundation of the world above, their bones supporting the weight of markets, homes, and streets. Every Parisian walking the city moved across this buried empire, separated from their ancestors by mere feet of earth and stone. The catacombs established a pattern that would define modern Paris. Horror buried beneath beauty, violence transformed into order through systematic organization. the willing sacrifice of individual dignity for collective utility. The dead had been processed, categorized, and arranged according to administrative necessity rather than human sentiment. The quarries had become a mirror city, the Paris of the dead, directly beneath the Paris of the living. Above ground, citizens conducted their daily business. Below, their predecessors watched from empty sockets, arranged in neat rows like books on shelves or tools in workshops. The project's completion marked the end of medieval burial practices in Paris. No longer would the dead claim space in the city above. They had been relocated to their proper place, underground, organized, and out of sight. The living had reclaimed the surface, consigning their ancestors to the darkness below where they belonged. The summer of 1880 began with an unusual drought. By June, the Seine had slowed to a sluggish trickle, its normal flow reduced to barely moving water that baked under an unrelenting sun. What followed was an environmental catastrophe that nearly drove the French government from its own capital. For centuries, Paris had treated the Seine as its primary sewer. Every privy, every storm drain, every industrial outlet emptied directly into the river. Tanneries dumped chemical-soaked animal waste. Slaughterhouses poured blood and offal into the current. Human excrement from 2 million residents flowed directly from building pipes into the water. This system functioned only because the Seine's flow carried waste downstream faster than it could accumulate. The river served as a moving conveyor belt, transporting the city's filth toward the channel before it could fester. But in 1880, that conveyor belt stopped. The drought reduced the Seine to a series of stagnant pools connected by the thinnest streams. Decades of accumulated sewage, industrial waste, and garbage now sat motionless in the summer heat. The sun beat down on this toxic soup day after day, cooking it into something that defied description. The smell began in early July. Citizens near the river reported a peculiar odor, sweet and rotten simultaneously. Within days, the stench had spread throughout central Paris. By mid-July, it had become unbearable. The very air seemed thick with putrefaction, a visible miasma that made breathing difficult. Newspapers struggled to capture the horror. "The atmosphere of Paris has become unbreathable," wrote Le Figaro. "Citizens flee their homes seeking relief that cannot be found. The city has become uninhabitable." But words failed to convey the sensory assault that had transformed Paris into an open-air cesspit. The Seine had become a baking cauldron of human waste. The water itself was no longer recognizable as liquid. It had achieved the consistency of thick soup, dark brown, and chunked with floating debris. The surface bubbled continuously as decomposing matter released gases. Dead fish floated belly up in rafts so thick they could support the weight of rats and birds. Citizens held handkerchiefs soaked in perfume over their faces. Shopkeepers burned incense continuously. Churches offered special masses for divine intervention. Nothing helped. The stench penetrated everything: clothing, food, furniture. There was no escape within the city limits. The wealthy fled to their country estates. Hotels in distant towns filled with Parisian refugees willing to pay any price for clean air. But most citizens lacked the resources to escape. They endured the apocalyptic conditions with growing desperation. Their city transformed into a toxic wasteland. Government offices emptied as officials retreated to emergency quarters outside Paris. Parliament debated relocating the entire French government until conditions improved. Foreign ambassadors requested permission to move their operations to alternative cities. The capital of France was evacuating itself. Medical authorities warned of cholera outbreaks. Typhoid spread through neighborhoods closest to the river. Children and elderly residents collapsed from respiratory distress. The city's hospitals, themselves contaminated by the omnipresent stench, struggled to treat patients while fighting their own institutional nausea. Business ground to a halt. Markets closed as vendors found their goods contaminated by the smell. Restaurants shuttered when customers refused to eat in the poisoned atmosphere. Tourism vanished overnight as word spread throughout Europe that Paris had become uninhabitable. The economic impact rippled beyond the city. Trade routes that depended on Parisian commerce collapsed. International contracts were suspended. France's political credibility suffered as foreign observers questioned a government that couldn't manage basic sanitation in its own capital. By August, the situation had reached crisis levels. The French state faced a choice between radical action and potential collapse. The medieval system of waste management had finally, catastrophically, failed. The city's body was rejecting itself, creating conditions that threatened the survival of the capital. Emergency measures proved useless. Attempts to mask the smell with perfumed water sprayed from fire engines only created a sickening combination of floral and fecal odors. Lime poured into the Seine reacted with the organic matter to produce clouds of toxic gas. Traditional solutions had become part of the problem. The Great Stink of 1880 lasted 4 months. Only autumn rains restored the Seine's flow, washing the accumulated filth toward the sea and allowing the city to breathe again. But the damage was permanent, not to buildings or infrastructure, but to the collective Parisian psyche. Citizens had experienced their city's mortality. They had smelled Paris dying, watched it become uninhabitable through its own waste. The romantic image of the Seine as a gentle river flowing through an elegant capital had been destroyed. Everyone now understood the river as what it truly was, an open sewer barely controlled by natural forces. The crisis created political will for radical transformation. The same government that had resisted infrastructure spending for decades suddenly found unlimited budgets for sewer construction. Engineers who had lobbied unsuccessfully for modern sanitation systems were given emergency authority to rebuild the city's entire waste management infrastructure. The Great Stink proved that beautiful Paris was a thin facade covering a fundamentally broken system. The city had reached the limits of medieval management techniques. Either it would modernize completely, or it would die from its own accumulated filth. Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann was not an architect. He was not an urban planner. He was not a humanitarian reformer. He was a weapon. In 1853, Emperor Napoleon III handed this provincial administrator unprecedented power over Paris, with a mandate that would reshape the Western world's understanding of urban warfare. Haussmann's mission carried 3 objectives that revealed the empire's true priorities: bring light and air to combat disease, improve traffic circulation through the medieval maze, and make the city insurrection-proof. The third objective was not an afterthought. It was the driving force behind everything that would follow. The narrow, winding medieval streets that had defined Parisian life for 8 centuries possessed a particular quality that terrified the empire. They were perfect for building barricades. During the 1830 revolution, ordinary citizens had transformed their neighborhoods into impenetrable fortresses using cobblestones, overturned carts, and furniture dragged from upper-story windows. The February Revolution of 1848 had proven even more efficient. Revolutionaries knew exactly which streets to block, which corners provided cover, which rooftops offered sniper positions. Napoleon III had watched his uncle's empire crumble under popular revolt. He would not repeat that mistake. Haussmann arrived in Paris with the cold efficiency of a military engineer surveying enemy territory. He studied the city not as a living community, but as a tactical problem requiring surgical correction. The ancient neighborhoods where generations of working families had built their lives represented nothing more than strategic vulnerabilities in the empire's defensive matrix. The man chosen for this work possessed exactly the right combination of administrative ruthlessness and aesthetic pretension. Haussmann had built his career in provincial postings where opposition carried no consequences. He understood how to deploy bureaucratic authority like a cudgel. More importantly, he possessed no sentimental attachment to Paris's medieval heritage. Where others saw centuries of accumulated history, Haussmann saw operational inefficiency. His first surveys revealed the scope of the challenge. The city's core consisted of neighborhoods so densely packed that sunlight never reached ground level. Streets barely wide enough for a single cart created choke points that could paralyze commerce for hours. The same narrow passages that had sheltered revolutionaries also trapped disease, sewage, and criminal activity in festering pools of urban decay. But the medical and commercial justifications for reconstruction served primarily as public relations cover for the project's true purpose. Haussmann was designing a city that could be held by force. The Baron's architectural vision emerged from military necessity rather than aesthetic theory. The famous boulevards that would define modern Paris were conceived as corridors of fire, straight lines that would allow artillery to sweep rebel positions without obstruction. The uniform building heights that created the city's iconic streetscapes served a practical function. They eliminated the rooftop irregularities that provided sniper cover. Even the placement of these new thoroughfares followed strategic logic. They would connect military barracks to potential trouble spots, allowing rapid deployment of troops. They would create clear sightlines from government buildings to working-class districts. Most crucially, they would slice through the dense neighborhoods where revolutionary organization flourished, fragmenting communities that had proven capable of sustained resistance. Haussmann's planning process revealed the authoritarian mindset behind the aesthetic facade. He operated through imperial decree rather than public consultation. Property owners discovered their buildings condemned through official notices posted on their doors. Entire blocks would be marked for demolition before residents learned their fate. The legal mechanisms that ordinarily protected private property were suspended in service of the greater transformation. The Baron assembled a bureaucratic machine designed to overwhelm resistance through administrative momentum. His staff included military engineers who understood siege warfare, financial experts who could manipulate municipal bonds, and legal specialists who crafted instruments of forced acquisition. This was not urban planning. It was institutional warfare waged against the city's existing population. Opposition to Haussmann's early projects confirmed the political wisdom of his approach. Traditional neighborhood leaders who might have organized collective resistance found themselves scattered across the city as their communities disintegrated. The social networks that had sustained revolutionary activity for decades were systematically dismantled through architectural intervention. The Baron's personal style reflected his mission's authoritarian nature. He maintained military discipline in his offices, demanded absolute obedience from subordinates, and treated public criticism as insubordination, requiring immediate correction. His relationship with Napoleon III functioned through shared understanding that Paris required conquest rather than governance. By 1854, Haussmann had completed his preliminary analysis of the city's strategic weaknesses. His staff had identified the neighborhoods requiring elimination, the boulevards requiring construction, and the legal mechanisms requiring deployment. The planning phase was complete. The wrecking balls were ready. The demolition began at dawn on April 15th, 1854. Haussmann's crews struck the Ile de la Cité first, not coincidentally, the ancient heart of Parisian rebellion. What followed was not urban renewal. It was architectural warfare, conducted with industrial precision. The massive demolition campaign that would reshape Paris over the next 2 decades displaced tens of thousands of poor Parisians to create the wide boulevards that tourists now admire. But these weren't romantic promenades designed for leisurely strolls. They were military corridors engineered for artillery deployment and cavalry charges. The scale of destruction defied contemporary understanding. Haussmann's wrecking crews demolished more than 20,000 buildings during his tenure as prefect. Entire neighborhoods that had existed since medieval times vanished in months. The Rue de Rivoli extension alone required obliterating 1,200 structures and displacing 12,000 residents. The Boulevard Saint-Germain carved through the left bank like a saber cut, eliminating blocks where revolutionary pamphlets had been printed for generations. Each demolished building represented a calculated military victory. The narrow medieval streets had functioned as natural fortifications during previous uprisings. Buildings standing close together provided cover for barricade construction. The irregular rooflines created sniper positions that could command multiple intersections. The maze-like layout allowed revolutionaries to disappear after attacks, melting back into neighborhoods where every resident knew the escape routes. Haussmann's boulevards eliminated these tactical advantages through geometric precision. The new thoroughfares measured exactly 24 meters wide, specifically calculated to prevent effective barricade construction while allowing military columns to deploy in combat formation. Artillery pieces required clear sightlines of at least 1 kilometer to be militarily effective. The Baron's street designers ensured that government forces positioned at major intersections could sweep rebel positions with cannon fire from distances that made return fire impossible. The construction process itself served as demonstration of state power. Demolition crews arrived without warning, often in the pre-dawn hours when resistance would be minimal. Residents awakened to find their buildings marked with red chalk, the empire's symbol for immediate destruction. Property owners received formal eviction notices that allowed 30 days for relocation, but demolition frequently began within weeks. The legal framework supporting this destruction had been carefully crafted to prevent meaningful opposition. The Law of Public Utility, passed in 1833, allowed municipal authorities to seize private property for projects deemed beneficial to society. Haussmann expanded this authority through administrative interpretation, arguing that any structure interfering with his street plans threatened public health and safety. Compensation payments were calculated to discourage resistance rather than provide fair value. Property assessments were conducted by municipal employees who understood that generous settlements would threaten the project's financial viability. Working-class families who had owned their buildings for generations discovered that compensation barely covered relocation costs, much less property replacement. The displaced population faced a housing market deliberately structured to scatter them across the city's periphery. Haussmann's reconstruction had eliminated thousands of affordable rental units in central neighborhoods, creating artificial scarcity that drove up prices beyond working-class means. Former residents of demolished districts found themselves forced into suburban communes or overcrowded tenements in areas without established community networks. This displacement served strategic purposes beyond simple land clearance. The traditional neighborhood structures that had sustained revolutionary organization required geographic stability. Families who had lived on the same streets for generations possessed the social connections necessary for collective action. Craftsmen who worked in the same districts where they resided could coordinate strikes and political demonstrations through established networks. Haussmann's demolition campaign systematically destroyed these revolutionary infrastructures. The Boulevard Saint-Michel eliminated the dense Latin Quarter neighborhoods where student radicals had organized for decades. The Avenue de l'Opéra carved through districts where Republican newspapers had operated since the Restoration. The Rue de Turbigo destroyed the artisan quarters where worker cooperatives had flourished. The new boulevards that rose from this destruction were designed to prevent the formation of similar revolutionary strongholds. The uniform building facades eliminated the architectural irregularities that had provided defensive positions during street fighting. The standardized street widths ensured that government forces could maintain visual control over potential gathering points. The geometric regularity of the new street grid made surveillance and patrol operations vastly more efficient than they had been in the medieval maze. Even the construction timeline served military objectives. Haussmann prioritized boulevards connecting government buildings to potential trouble spots, ensuring that troops could deploy rapidly during crises. The Boulevard de Sébastopol provided direct access from the military barracks at Vincennes to the traditional revolutionary strongholds on the left bank. The Avenue Victoria connected the Hôtel de Ville to neighborhoods where the 1848 uprising had achieved its most dangerous successes. By 1860, the transformation was producing its intended results. The massive construction projects had absorbed thousands of displaced workers into imperial employment, creating economic dependence on the regime they might otherwise have opposed. The destruction of traditional neighborhoods had scattered potential revolutionary networks across a much wider geographic area. Most importantly, the new street system had eliminated the urban terrain that had made popular rebellion tactically feasible. The wrecking ball renaissance was complete. Paris had been conquered by its own government. The shovels broke ground in January 1854, not for another boulevard or monument, but for something far more urgent, a network of tunnels that would determine whether Paris lived or died. Baron Eugène Belgrand stood knee-deep in the filthy water of the Bièvre, surveying the medieval nightmare that passed for Paris's drainage system. The same open channels that had poisoned the city for 8 centuries still carried human waste directly into drinking water. The same Roman-era aqueducts, cracked and contaminated, still supplied wells that killed more Parisians than they sustained. The Great Stink had revealed the stakes. This wasn't urban planning, it was emergency surgery on a dying patient. Belgrand understood what most engineers refused to accept. Paris wasn't just badly designed. It was fundamentally cursed by geology. The city sat on unstable clay and sand that turned to quicksand when wet. Every foundation sank. Every drain collapsed. Every attempt to channel water through the earth met the same fate as the Romans had discovered 18 centuries earlier. The ground simply would not cooperate. But Belgrand had studied London. He had watched Sir Joseph Bazalgette solve an identical crisis by thinking not around the problem, but through it. If the surface couldn't be saved, abandon the surface. Build an entirely new city underneath the old one. The scale defied comprehension. Belgrand proposed excavating 347 miles of tunnels beneath existing streets, more than the distance from Paris to Brussels, all of it carved through unstable earth that had frustrated engineers since Caesar's legions. These wouldn't be simple drainage ditches. They would be underground boulevards, tall enough for workers to walk upright, wide enough for maintenance boats engineered with the precision of cathedrals, two separate networks. Fresh water flowing into the city through one system, wastewater flowing out through another. Never mixing, never contaminating. The principle was surgical, complete separation of clean and dirty, with no possibility of cross-connection. The excavation began at the Seine. Teams of diggers worked in 8-hour shifts, hauling tons of clay and rock to the surface, while wooden supports held back the weight of entire buildings above their heads. The mortality rate was acceptable by 19th century standards, which meant workers died regularly, crushed by cave-ins or poisoned by methane gas that seeped from rotting organic matter in the earth. Belgrand drove them forward with military precision. Each tunnel section had to be completed before the next could begin. Each joint had to seal perfectly, tested under maximum water pressure. The engineering tolerances were unforgiving. A single leak could flood entire neighborhoods, turning basement levels into underground lakes of sewage. The first major breakthrough came in 1856. Water from the Douai River, channeled through Belgrand's aqueduct system, flowed clean and cold into Parisian taps for the first time in the city's history. Residents reported that the water actually tasted like water, not the metallic tang of rust and decay they had accepted as normal. But the sewage network proved far more complex. Medieval Paris had no systematic waste removal because medieval Paris had assumed waste would simply disappear. Absorbed into the earth, washed away by rain, processed by an urban ecosystem that had collapsed under its own toxicity centuries earlier. Belgrand's sewers had to accommodate not just human waste, but the runoff from slaughterhouses, tanneries, dye works, and chemical factories that dumped their refuse directly into street drains. The volume overwhelmed every calculation. During heavy rains, the tunnels filled to capacity within minutes, creating underground rivers of industrial poison that moved through the city faster than the surface traffic above. The solution required brutal mathematical precision. Belgrand mapped every source of contamination, calculated flow rates during peak usage, and designed overflow systems that could handle the worst-case scenarios. When the network couldn't process the volume, excess sewage would be diverted to treatment facilities outside the city limits, the first systematic attempt to make Paris's waste someone else's problem. By 1860, the network extended beneath most of central Paris. Tourists began requesting guided boat tours through the tunnels, marveling at the Gothic arches and engineering precision of what newspapers called the underground cathedral. Victor Hugo devoted entire chapters of Les Miserables to these sewers, describing them as the conscience of the city, dark, hidden, but absolutely essential to life above ground. The irony was deliberate. Paris had always been built on burial. The catacombs held 6 million skeletons. Now the sewers held something equally vast but more dangerous: the liquid remains of industrial civilization, flowing in carefully controlled channels beneath the feet of citizens who never had to see, smell, or acknowledge what their comfortable lives required. Belgrand understood the psychology as clearly as the engineering. Parisians could tolerate any amount of horror as long as it remained invisible. The medieval system had failed because it forced residents to confront their own waste every day, in the streets, in the water, in the air they breathed. The new system succeeded by making that same waste disappear completely. The cost was extraordinary. Not just the 180 million francs in construction expenses, but the social reorganization required to make the network function. Entire industries had to change their waste disposal methods. Property owners had to connect their buildings to the new system at their own expense. The city had to hire armies of maintenance workers who spent their careers in tunnels that most Parisians would never see. But it worked. By 1870, Paris had become the first major city in Europe to achieve complete separation of drinking water and sewage. The cholera epidemic stopped. The infant mortality rate dropped by 60%. The Seine, while still polluted, no longer killed people who fell into it. The sewers represented more than engineering triumph. They embodied a new relationship between civilization and waste. Instead of trying to eliminate the horrible byproducts of urban life, Paris had learned to hide them so effectively that they became invisible. The city above could maintain its beauty precisely because the city below handled its ugliness with industrial efficiency. This principle would define modern Paris. Every elegant solution concealed a brutal mechanism. Every beautiful vista required an underground empire of hidden infrastructure. The city of light had learned to shine by burying its darkness so deep that citizens could forget it existed, even as they depended on it for survival. The eviction notices arrived at dawn, January 15th, 1859. Entire neighborhoods received the same message, printed on official prefecture paper. By order of the Imperial Commission, this building will be demolished within 60 days. Occupants must vacate immediately. No compensation will be provided. This was Haussmann's weapon of choice, not artillery or police batons, but legal documentation that accomplished what military force never could: the systematic displacement of Paris's working class through architectural violence. The targets weren't random. Haussmann's team had spent 5 years mapping every building, every street, every neighborhood in central Paris according to a precise social calculus. They identified which areas housed the dangerous classes, the artisans, laborers, and small merchants who had built every barricade, fought every revolution, and challenged every government since 1789. These neighborhoods shared certain characteristics that made them militarily unacceptable: narrow streets that blocked cavalry charges, buildings with thick walls that stopped artillery shells, interconnected courtyards and passages that allowed insurgents to move between blocks without exposing themselves to government forces. Most dangerous of all, social networks where working families had lived for generations, creating the solidarity that turned individual discontent into collective rebellion. Haussmann's solution was elegant in its brutality: destroy the physical infrastructure that made resistance possible and scatter the human networks that made resistance probable. The Ile de la Cité became the first testing ground, medieval Paris's historic heart, where narrow streets wound between ancient buildings like a maze designed to frustrate invading armies. Exactly the kind of defensive terrain that had sheltered revolutionaries for 7 centuries. The demolition crews arrived with military precision. Building by building, block by block, they reduced 800 years of accumulated history to rubble and dust. Entire families lost not just their homes but their life's work. Shops that had served the same customers for decades. Workshops where fathers taught sons trades that stretched back to the guild system. The human cost was carefully uncalculated. Haussmann's administration kept detailed records of construction expenses, engineering specifications, and completion schedules. They maintained no records of how many families were displaced, where they went, or whether they survived the transition. The displaced poor vanished from official documentation as completely as their demolished buildings vanished from the landscape. But displacement was only half the strategy. The new constructions served a specific military function that had nothing to do with urban beauty or commercial efficiency. The Grands Boulevards followed artillery trajectories. Engineers calculated the optimal angles for cannon fire from strategic points throughout the city. then designed streets to provide clear lines of sight between government strongholds and potential uprising zones. The famous tree-lined avenues weren't aesthetic choices. They were killing fields disguised as public amenities. The boulevard widths followed cavalry requirements. Haussmann consulted with military commanders to determine exactly how much space mounted troops needed to charge effectively against barricades. Every major street was designed to accommodate rapid deployment of government forces from suburban barracks to urban flashpoints. The building heights followed crowd control principles. The new apartment blocks rose to uniform 6-story heights, not for architectural harmony, but to eliminate rooftop positions that had allowed insurgents to rain projectiles down on government troops. The mansard roofs, now considered quintessentially Parisian, were actually military specifications, too steep for snipers, too exposed for defensive positions. Even the famous stone facades served counterinsurgency purposes. The uniform limestone construction eliminated the material diversity that had allowed revolutionaries to tear up cobblestones, wooden shutters, and iron fixtures to build barricades. The new streets offered nothing portable, nothing that could be quickly converted into defensive obstacles. The displaced workers didn't simply disappear. They were systematically relocated to new industrial suburbs, Belleville, Ménilmontant, La Villette, that shared crucial characteristics: geographic isolation from central Paris, dependence on government-controlled transportation, and complete absence of the defensive terrain that had made urban warfare possible. These suburbs weren't accidental spillover from central reconstruction. They were carefully planned containment zones, designed to concentrate the working class in areas where rebellion would remain localized and easily suppressed. Wide, straight roads allowed rapid deployment of troops. Industrial architecture provided no materials for barricades. Most importantly, distance from the city center meant that suburban uprisings couldn't immediately threaten government buildings or financial districts. The rent structure enforced this geographic segregation with mathematical precision. The new central apartments were priced beyond working-class reach, not by market forces, but by deliberate policy. Haussmann's team calculated exactly how much rent increases were necessary to guarantee that only the bourgeoisie and aristocracy could afford to live in reconstructed areas. This wasn't gentrification. It was social engineering on a scale never before attempted. An entire city's population redistributed according to income, with geographic distance serving as a buffer between classes. The wealthy occupied the defensively vulnerable but symbolically important center. The poor were exiled to peripheral zones, where their political activity was no immediate threat to the regime. The results exceeded military expectations. The Paris Commune of 1871 proved Haussmann's strategy correct, but also revealed its limitations. The relocated working class did rebel more violently than ever before, but they rebelled from the periphery, allowing the government to contain the uprising to specific neighborhoods and systematically destroy them through artillery bombardment. The communards fought desperately, but they fought from the suburbs. Central Paris, with its wide boulevards and bourgeois residents, remained largely under government control. Haussmann's reconstruction had successfully separated the symbolic heart of French power from the social base of French Revolution. The beautiful avenues that tourists would later celebrate as architectural masterpieces had accomplished their primary purpose, fracturing the urban solidarity that had made popular uprisings possible. Every elegant vista represented a calculated act of social warfare. Every harmonious facade concealed a system designed to prevent the poor from threatening the rich. The City of Light had achieved its luminosity by casting its shadows elsewhere, pushing the darkness to carefully designated zones where it could burn without illuminating the power structure that contained it. The Paris that emerged from Haussmann's reconstruction was not simply beautiful. It was beautiful with a purpose. Every element that now defines the city's iconic appearance, the uniform stone facades, the geometric precision of intersecting boulevards, the clean river flowing beneath elegant bridges, represents a calculated victory over specific horrors. The limestone buildings weren't chosen for aesthetics alone. They replaced structures literally falling apart from centuries of structural decay and human waste. Wide avenues didn't emerge from urban planning theory. They were carved through neighborhoods where cholera had killed thousands and revolution had flourished in narrow, defensible streets. By 1914, Paris had achieved something unprecedented in European urban history. A city born in a swamp, suffocated by its own waste, and literally built on millions of human bones, had transformed itself into the continent's most admired capital. But this transformation came at a cost that extended far beyond Haussmann's massive budget overruns. The social reorganization was permanent and intentional. The poor hadn't simply been displaced, they had been systematically relocated to create a new urban geography based on economic segregation. The wealthy occupied the center, breathing clean air and walking on paved streets above Belgrade's hidden sewer system. The working classes inhabited the periphery, pushed beyond the old city walls to districts that lacked the infrastructure investments lavished on central Paris. This geographical separation created the foundation for modern Parisian social dynamics. The revolution-prone masses who had built barricades in 1848 no longer lived within quick marching distance of the government buildings. The bourgeoisie who strolled the new boulevards no longer encountered daily reminders of urban poverty. The city's appearance suggested order, prosperity, and social harmony because disorder, poverty, and conflict had been architecturally marginalized. The underground infrastructure completed this transformation. Belgrade's sewers didn't merely solve sanitation problems. They created a parallel city beneath the surface where all evidence of human waste disappeared. The catacombs served a similar function for death itself, providing an organized, invisible repository for the reality that all cities must confront. Everyone dies, and the bodies must go somewhere. Modern Paris functions as a masterpiece of selective visibility. Tourists photograph the Seine without knowing it once flowed thick with human excrement. They admire Haussmannian architecture without recognizing it as the physical manifestation of authoritarian urban control. They visit the catacombs as a curiosity, not understanding that they represent the logical endpoint of a city that literally ran out of space for its dead. The transformation succeeded so completely that Paris became the template for modern urban planning worldwide. Cities across Europe and beyond adopted Haussmann-style boulevards, underground sewer systems, and zoned development patterns. The Parisian model of burying ugliness beneath beautiful surfaces became the standard approach to metropolitan design. Yet the buried elements never disappeared entirely. During World War II, Parisians sheltered in the same underground quarries where millions of bones had been stored. The resistance used Haussmann's sewers to move through the city undetected. The infrastructure created to contain and control Paris served different masters during the occupation, but it continued to function exactly as designed, as hidden networks beneath a beautiful surface. The contemporary visitor to Paris walks through what amounts to an exquisitely maintained crime scene. The evidence has been cleaned up, the bodies properly buried, the chaos replaced with geometric order. But the violence that created this beauty remains legible in the urban landscape for anyone who knows how to read the architectural scars. Every photograph of Paris captures a successful cover-up. The couples kissing on the Pont Neuf stand above water that once carried corpses downstream from the morgue. The cafes lining the Boulevard Saint-Germain occupy ground where medieval houses collapsed under the weight of accumulated human waste. The tourists admiring Notre Dame's Gothic spires breathe air that was once thick enough with sewage fumes to choke horses. 6 million skeletons rest beneath the city streets, arranged in neat walls within the world's largest grave. Above them, the beautiful limestone city continues its daily routines, supported by infrastructure built in direct response to unspeakable urban horrors. The City of Light earned its name through a literal process, by conquering darkness so absolute that contemporary minds struggle to comprehend its scope. The light came at a price measured in demolished neighborhoods, displaced populations, and authoritarian reconstruction that prioritized order over human cost. Paris succeeded where other European capitals failed because it was willing to acknowledge its fundamental problems and apply radical solutions. It buried its dead properly. It contained its waste systematically. It replaced chaos with control through architectural force. The result is a city whose beauty cannot be separated from its buried darkness. Modern Paris exists because medieval Paris was too horrible to endure. Walk down any Parisian street and remember, you are strolling through a graveyard.